Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Duchemin. I'm the president and CEO of the Briscoe Western Art Museum, and it's our pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for our panel discussion about the lessons from our fathers, looking at the sons of Charlie Russell, the cowboy artists of America. We have a great panel with you for you this afternoon to discuss the exhibition and the history of the cowboy artists. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers. Before I do that, I would like to say thank you to our sponsors who've made the exhibit and all of our programs possible, beginning with the Elizabeth Huth Coates Charitable Foundation of 1992, the Eddie Basha Collection, Jan McCabe Elliott, Mr. and Mrs. Mars McLean Bowman, Teresa and Luther King Capital Management, the Clessy Foundation, Jessica Elliott Middleton, Debbie and John Monford, and Western Art Collector Magazine. So if we could have a round of applause for all of them, thank you so much. We cannot do exhibitions and programs without that support. I also would like to recognize two of our host committee sponsors who are with us today, Kathy Meyer and Tony Cantu, and Barbara and George Williams. So thank you to our host committee as well. And also Nancy Leffler, one of our board members and one of our officers of the National Western Art Foundation, our parent, is here. So, and thank you, Nancy, for your support. To get started, let me begin by introducing Byron Price. Byron is in the center position there. Byron Price is Professor Emeritus of Art History at the University of Oklahoma, where he held the Charles Merriam Russell Memorial Chair and directed the Charles M. Russell Center for the Study of Art of the American West for 2 decades. Much of that time, Price also directed the University of Oklahoma Press. Before coming to the university, Byron spent nearly 25 years in the museum profession, serving as executive director of the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum in Canyon, Texas, the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City, and the Buffalo Bill Historical Center in Cody, Wyoming. He is author of numerous magazine and journal articles about Western American history and art, and has written or edited a dozen books and monographs, most recently Edward Borain, Etched by the West, which was published by the Santa Barbara Historical Museum. Great book if you have a chance to take a look at it. Also with us today in the other center position is Michael Grauer. Michael is a McCaslin Chair of Cowboy Culture and Curator of the Cowboy Collections and Western Art at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. Mr. Grauer holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Art History from the University of Kansas, a Master of Arts in Art History from Southern Methodist University, and the Masters of Arts in History from West Texas A&M University. Grauer's career began at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and he has served as curator of art for 35 years. Michael has curated over 150 exhibitions on Western art, culture, and history, and authored 70 publications. He received the University of Kansas Crest Foundation Department of Art History's Distinguished Alumnus Award in 2012. In September 2021, his recent book, Making a Hand, The Art of H.D. Bugbee, received the Western History Association Wrangler Award for the Best Western Art Book of 2020. Last October, the Kansas Cowboy Hall of Fame at Dodge City, Kansas, inducted him as Cowboy Historian for 2021. Also with us is Seth M. Hopkins. Seth Hopkins is the executive director of the Booth Western Art Museum in Cartersville, Georgia, a position that he's held since 2000. Prior to entering the museum profession, Hopkins worked in the fields of journalism, public relations, and telecommunications management. Seth holds an undergraduate degree in journalism from Syracuse University. He completed coursework in art history at Kennesaw State University, Georgia State University, and the University of Wyoming, and museum studies courses at West Georgia State University in 2005. He received a master's degree in museum studies from the University of Oklahoma. He titled his master's thesis, Andy Warhol Played Cowboys and Indians. Hopkins twice served as a juror for the annual Arts of the Parks exhibition in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and has judged the annual Cowboy Artists of America exhibition and sale in Phoenix, Arizona. Seth has published articles in American Art Review, Western Art Collector, and Persimmon Hill. In 2010, he was honored with the prestigious Kennesaw State University Flourish Award, given annually to a leader who's helped the arts flourishing in Georgia. I got to finish now. He
tried to help you.
He has also served as the president of the Museums West Consortium, a group of 13 Western museums in North America, and is a honorary member of the Cowboy Artists of America. And lastly, but not least, on our panel, Emily Wilson. Emily is curator of art for the Briscoe Western Art Museum here in San Antonio, and the former senior curator of the C.M. Russell Museum in Great Falls, Montana. Ms. Wilson holds a master's degree in art history from Indiana University. She's curated a number of exhibits on the art of the American West and contributed essays to catalogs on that topic. She enjoys the outdoors and hiking in national parks, resides in San Antonio with her daughter. So please, if you will, join me in a welcome round of applause for our panelists and our moderator for today. Thank you. Just as a 1-minute introduction, this exhibit was something that came out of a project that Seth and I worked on back in 2018, I think it was, an exhibition called Into the New West, where we featured a selection of work from the Booth Museum collection here at the Briscoe Museum. And that exhibit really used or looked at the Institute of American Indian Arts and the artists from that school of art and how they might have influenced Western art. And then in the wake of that exhibit, it really felt like we needed to go back and look at the other great school of Western art, the Cowboy Artists of America, that has kept alive this tradition of representational realism in art since the 1960s. And so this show was a follow-up to that exhibition from 2018. And in looking at it, and especially over the last few years, our goal, one of our big questions we asked with the exhibit was, what is the value of maintaining tradition? What's the relevance of tradition, and how do we hold on to it today? And in Western art, that's what the Cowboy Artists of America, one of their mandates that they selected for themselves was to keep alive these traditions in art. The exhibit is really meant to be able to show that and reflect upon that idea. And that's one of the topics that our panelists will hit on today. So again, thank you for being here, and I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thank you, Michael, for those wonderful introductions. So now I'm in the wonderful position to be able to ask the questions and just listen to the great answers from our panelists here. So I'm going to start out by just stating that the CAA has been one of the longest running artist collectives since their founding in 1965, about 57 years. Their objectives, which have remained the same, are stated as thus: to perpetuate the memory and culture of the Old West as typified by the late Frederick Remington, Charles Russell, and others, to ensure authentic representations of the life of the West as it was and is, to maintain standards of quality in contemporary Western art, to help guide collectors of Western art, to give mutual assistance and protection of artists' rights, to conduct a trail ride and camp out in some locality of special interest, and to hold an annual joint exhibition of the works of active members. Can you reflect on the importance of maintaining their tradition and perhaps how successive generations of artists may have adapted and reinvigorated it?
You're first. You wrote the book, man. You got to start.
Repeat the question.
So
It's a
can you
three-part
talk
question.
about the importance of the cowboy artists maintaining their tradition of perpetuating the memory and culture of the Old West in their art in Russell and Remington, and also painting an authentic representation of the life of the West as it was and is today?
Well, I think that the artists who made up the Cowboy Artists of America, and those certainly the founders of that group, felt that the work was the historic work that they were wanting to preserve in the lifestyle of the people that they wanted to paint was worthwhile on the one hand, and that there was some danger of it not of it going by the wayside, and so I think that was a motivating factor, and they obviously did it quite well. They were operating in a long tradition of representational art and subject matter that was appealing, had been appealing and essential to American life for many years. And yet by the 1950s and early 60s, other aspects of life have begun to overshadow these people and their accomplishments, and I believe that cowboy artists had a real effort to make sure that they did not recede into the background, but continued to show that they were still the subjects that they painted, the Native Americans and cowboys and other Western figures. The landscape was still vital and still important, and I think they have succeeded quite well.
I would say it's instructive perhaps to, let's pretend we go in a time machine back to 1964, 65, let's say, and think about that there were maybe, 3 or 4 of the Western museums that we know today had been established at that point. There were very few galleries, if any, that had gotten started that were especially in Western art. There were very few artists who were making a good living doing Western art. Yet there were these founders who had gotten together and said, hey, we need to see if we can band together and create something that's going to help us make a living and perpetuate these ideas that we believe in. To today, where you've got dozens of galleries, you have magazines, you have probably 24 museums that specialize in the Western subject matter. There might be 2,000 or 3,000 artists out there trying to make a living doing Western or related subjects. That's a pretty big difference, in that 50, 60, 70-year time frame. And I think the cowboy artists deserve a fair amount of credit, if not a big chunk of it, for that riding of that wave of Western art that we've been on in this last 50, 60 years. So, wanting those traditions, actually, if you think about it in those terms in 64, 65, if you picked up an art magazine, it would have been abstract expressionism, would have been pop art, would have been new contemporary art, whatever that might be, that generally was not representational. And so, as strange as it might seem, the cowboy artists of those days were actually counterculture. They were swimming against the stream, not with it, in terms of what was going on in the art world. And so, I think they deserve that credit for, being there and initiating that group, getting with the museum in Oklahoma City and getting started. And I know Byron will talk more later about the influence that museums have had with the cowboy artists and with Western art in general. One thing I wanted to also mention real quick, it was mentioned I'm an honorary member of the group, and so I'm doing my best to have my journalism hat on one side and my honorary cowboy hat on the other side to keep things fair and balanced, as they say. But also, if we might just take 1 second to remember our friend Lauren Entz, the great cowboy artist member who we lost just a couple of weeks ago. Was such a gentleman, a great artist, and it was a great shock to us to have lost him recently. And so if you might just join me in a moment for Lauren. Thank you.
I jump in and picking up on what Seth was talking about and what Byron's alluded to is I don't know that it's any coincidence that the Cowboy Artists of America was founded the same year the National Cowboy Hall of Fame opened in Oklahoma City in 1965. But go back even 10 years before that, when a man who worked for the Lee Jeans Company decided that there needed to be a monument to the cowboys and pioneers that built the American West, and that was Chester Reynolds in Kansas City, after visiting the Will Rogers Memorial in Claremore, Oklahoma in 1953. I mean, this guy went out on a limb at Cheyenne Frontier Days Rodeo in 1953 and said, I want to get together with politicians and performers and rodeo performers, et cetera, and cattlemen, and see if this thing would fly and where would it land. And eventually it landed in Oklahoma City and opened in 1965 with nothing in it. There was a museum with no artifacts, so everything was borrowed. But the very next year, Cowboy Artists of America stepped up in partnership with the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, and it was a bully pulpit. I mean, it was a bully pulpit, and it was a vital bully pulpit at that time. If you think in terms of the greater arts that were going on, and let's just select film, what were the films going on that bumped into the Western genre? I'm a Clint Eastwood fan, but no character did Clint Eastwood ever play had anything to do with a cowboy. It was the anti-hero Westerns that were going on at that time. And I truly believe that what the CAs founded in 1965 was pushback. Seth talked about that. They were the counterinsurgency on some level because Mr. Reynolds felt that those honorifics that goes with being a pioneer were under attack, were being threatened. And I think the CAs, consciously or not, picked up that baton and said, we'll carry it forward as well. And so that partnership that happened with the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in '66 was vital to both institutions and ultimately on a national and ultimately international scale. So that's how I would respond to that.
I'd also say that San Antonio was the site of the very first Western based art show out at the fairgrounds during the livestock show in the 60s. And out of that show came others in emulation and these organizations, but San Antonio has a real connection from at least the first one that I could find, where the themes were and the subject matter of the show was overtly Western.
And I would say also the culture in general in the country, 64, 65, 66 on up. You got JFK being shot, MLK being shot, you've got the Vietnam War going on, you've got all these things that are causing angst throughout the country. I think the people who grew up in the 30s, 40s, and 50s watching these Western movies and the good guy, the bad guy, the mythic West, all those stories, just seem so, somewhat romantic yet simple, and we're counter to what they were seeing on the nightly news every night. And it was an opportunity to cling back to those things and to embrace them. I've also heard generally most of the collectors I've dealt with over the years are very entrepreneurial types, and they saw themselves in the art. And at that period of time, the people who were in the entrepreneurial businesses, like oil and cattle ranching and others, were drawn to that subject matter. And so I think it was the right place at the right time for a group of artists with a ripe group of collectors.
Well, and likewise, things are cyclical in the art world. The last time the U.S. was under great threat was the Great Depression, and the New Deal art programs in a large portion turned to Western themes for public art, especially murals, some of the easel paintings under the Public Works of Art project and so on. They tended to turn towards Western themes and also agricultural themes that returned to the land, the roots, the values, and everything that went along with that. So that angst, national angst that Seth was talking about, also played a role in returning to what feels good and comfortable. Even though Gene and Roy were under assault in the 60s for being trivial and trite, there was still some good in there. And so I think the CAs were trying to hang on to that with all their might and say, there's value in the people that still punch cows and still drive a tractor, and all this kind of stuff. Now, I'm not saying that it went like this Nash Vegas music you hear on the radio today, which is a bunch of nonsense. That's not that kind of trash. But what I'm saying is that they really felt strongly that there was value in that, just like there was value in returning to the values in the 30s. Post World War II, the same thing happened, and then once again into the 60s. So there's merit in their work. And they saw that, maybe, as I said, subconsciously perhaps, but it was an important message to talk about through their art, whether that be painting, sculpture, whatever. So.
Thank you. So as we've seen through the tour, many of the CAA artists come from an illustrative background, similar to artists that were painting the West at the turn of the 20th century. And so what do you all think makes for this appeal or ease of transition into painting fine art and Western subjects from the illustrative background?
I'm going to jump in here because I've done a lot of work on Western illustration in the last few years. We have a tendency to be a little elitist about the ability to see a painting in a museum setting. Most people, especially in rural America, they saw their art in printed materials, whether that was the cover of Ranch Romances or the Quarter Horse Journal. That's the only kind of art those people ever saw. So the covers get tore off and they get tacked on the wall of the bunkhouses or in the barn or wherever it is. That's art to them. Now we, unfortunately, in our elitist senses, we kind of make fun of that. But those images that are torn off the covers of Quarter Horse Journal, wherever it was, they were storytelling pictures. And art is ultimately a communication device. It's a conduit to tell a story. Now, modern art theory drifts away from that and pushes that narrative. Isn't that interesting? They push a narrative about not being narrative. But those storytelling pictures, they had great appeal, and they still do. Because we will still want to be able to tell a story. We're still sitting around the campfire listening to Grandpa tell a story through a picture or a sculpture or whoever that is, or whatever medium that is. That's where I see it comes from. And so that's the familiarity in being able to tell a good story like Tom Lovell could. But it's based in, to coin to paraphrase Grant Wood, hard visual data. To be able to tell a good story using a figure, and he always said that, Grant Wood did, I have to have hard visual data. That's why I make so many sketches. I make sketches and studies to see how it works out. So I think that's important to remember. It's art is storytelling. Simple as that. Even if it's not telling a story, it's still telling a story.
Emily, say the question again in terms of the transition.
Yeah, just because so many of the artists that, were in the illustrative tradition, and not even just, well, of course, even from the turn of the century, but the CAA artists from the 60s and the 70s that were working on movie posters and novels. How do you think this was that ease, appeal of transition from that illustrative to then turning to Western art subject matter?
They, as artists, had been told what to do for year after year after year, and were under constraints from the art directors in terms of the assignments that they got. And the ones who got to do some Western subjects, be they in the publications Michael mentioned or Saturday Evening Post, which probably was the #1 purveyor of those art pieces stuck up on the wall somewhere, that I think they gravitated to those a little bit, and those being, again, romantic to the movies they probably had all grown up on. It also had the freedom that I think perhaps they yearned for artistically, to be able to paint what they wanted when they wanted, perhaps. And illustration was drying up by the 60s and 70s as photography was taking over, and eventually computers would take over that world. And so there were less and less opportunities for illustrators to make a living. As the CA is getting started and creating a market for contemporary Western art, the first artists who came out and got involved in that or got their buddies back in Connecticut and New Jersey that are seeing what's going on, and they say, boy, this looks like a fun deal. Move out west and get a horse and a ranchette and, do some Western subjects and get involved with this group if I can. And sounds like a great lifestyle. And I think a lot of them were drawn to that specifically. Now, many of them were some of the greatest artists that have been in the group because of that training ground, learning to work from reference, learning to treat it as a job, not just paint when you're inspired, but to work at it and to do research and have some authenticity to it. And those are things they would have had to done in illustration, although much more quickly. And so when they had the opportunity, I think, to work at a little bit more of their own pace, of course, they're still working against the deadlines of the shows and other things, that, it created some beautiful art and some very well done art.
I think also that museums, as Michael alluded to, had a profound impact on the establishing a strong base for Western American art, a base in terms of collectors, a base in terms of credibility, providing a space that gave depth to the contemporary artists by showing the work of those that preceded them, and who invested in programming and exhibitions that reflected the art of the West and the subject matter of the West. And I don't believe that we would be sitting here in this museum talking about the subject if it hadn't been for the Cowboy Hall of Fame, Dean Crakel, as director, realized this, and others, the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, as it's known now, but historical center in those days, was certainly at the forefront of this movement. And imitation is a sincere form of flattery, and certainly once the museums began to experience some success with shows, and it was all experimental in those days. It's so today it's just expected, but in those days they didn't know if anybody would come, but they certainly did, and they were connected to they were connected to real life, and they were also connected to the world of film and television, and all of that mixed and mingled together in a very happy sort of collaboration that owes a lot to luck in its own way. But there were these illustrators that we've talked about who were very disciplined, the Robert Lockheeds, the John Clymers, many of those that Harold von Schmitz and others that you've seen in the galleries upstairs, that had real talent, and they embraced a subject that was well established in people's minds, and attractive to broad subject matter, and that helped Western art get a toehold that they haven't relinquished to today.
Well, did Mr. Russell refer to himself? I'm an illustrator. I'm a teller of stories.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't. They didn't. I don't think Remington gave it a second thought. It's Remington was criticized from time to time for using a camera in his work, but I defy you to see any photograph he ever took that had any relationship to Downing the Nye Leader, the famous photograph of the stagecoach with a horse going down in a way that I can't even imagine how he I'd rather that artists tell you about how they go about getting that done, but to me that's the epitome of imagination. So they had a strong base to work from in the illustrators of the past. and many of them transitioned into easel painters in their own lifetimes. And so there was already a fairly substantial base and tradition of Western art that was just then carried forward into a more contemporary setting, and that was one of the factors that helped it flourish.
Well, frankly, dilettante art historians created the fact that illustration is somehow a dirty word, because illustrators used to be very, very well respected as artists. It was just a matter of patronage. A private collector buying an easel painter's work, a publishing house buying an illustrator's work, and somehow that got conflated. Primarily in the late 50s and 60s, when art historians got a hold of that and created a phase called the mere illustrator. Slop and paint, man. I mean, it doesn't matter who's paying for that, quite frankly. And I would slightly dispute my colleague on the other end there about publishing houses telling the artist what to paint. I don't think it was quite that cut and dry. My work on Buck Dunton, for example, Buck never took directions from anybody. He might be given a passage that was written and say, make an image that relates to this, but I think that's been very much jaded in the minds of the scholars. Unfortunately, the artists started to believe it too. So you'll have artists who start being sneering at being an illustrator, and I think that's just a mistake. Let's remember it's still about slop and paint.
And if we're going to venerate illustrators, where are we going to draw the line? Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, they had a patron, they created a piece for a patron. That's an illustration, right? If it's illustrating a story, whether it's the Bible or Saturday Evening Post.
Absolutely.
So when Byron helped us put the collection together at the booth, we had two great Harold von Schmidt paintings, and at the time we had an illustration gallery. We had the fine art gallery, put one in each gallery, and we waited for somebody to show up and tell us one was in the wrong place. Never happened. And, Howard Terpning, being probably the biggest name in the contemporary world and still alive today among the Cowboy Artists alumni, he would be famous as an illustrator if he hadn't become famous as an oil painter, in my estimation. Between the late 50s and the early 70s, he did more great movie posters than anybody. And of the top 10 most recognizable movie posters of all time, he's the only one that has two in there. One for the quintessential Southern movie, Gone with the Wind. The other is that lady running down the hill with a guitar case with some kids chasing after her. Sound of Music. So he would be famous for those images, and you say, wait a minute. Gone with the Wind came out in 1939. Howard's old, but he's not that old. Well, the artwork for when they released Gone with the Wind in 1939 was so bad. When they re-released it in 1969 for the 30th anniversary, they went and got Howard to create that image of the kiss. That's Howard's work. So, is that not great art? I'd hang it in my house.
So, Byron, you had mentioned the role of Western art museums that they've played in sustaining the Cowboy Artists of America over the span of the organization. And as we know, they've been critically important in the early decades, hosting their yearly shows and building a patron base. Now that the Cowboy Artists have severed their ties to museums as hosts for their shows, do museums still have a role to play? And in some respects, have museums' Western art auctions help fill the introductory gap between patron and CAA artists?
Well, I think the museums have been critical, and they'll continue to be critical, and because they are, in a sense, set the standard for quality, and for better or worse, and they provide a home base, and organizations have always ebbed and flowed. They have a life of their own as organizations, and sometimes museums have created their own organizations and fostered. When the CAs originally were showing at the Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City, and eventually didn't see eye to eye with the museum's administration for whatever reason. Then when they were gone, the museum created their own group of artists and fostered an entirely new sort of show, and ultimately some of the CEAs came back to the museum, the Cowboy Museum, and showed there, as well as continued to show in their home show at wherever it might be. So I think museums have been critical, and I would say they were the most important element, single element, not exclusively, but the most important single element in fostering the contemporary Western art movement by providing credibility and a space where quality could be demonstrated in the company of other styles and time periods and artists.
So I find humor and social commentary either on the modernizing of the West, there we are, or in people's relations with one another was an important aspect in Russell's art, and we've included the works up here with humor in this show from CAA artists Fred Harmon, New Era Steer Roping, and David Hallbach's When Up Is Down. Do you think these topics and approaches come through as well in the CAA artists' work, maybe less important than other topics? So is there things that have been passed down or retained that they've drawn from these traditions and the Russell's art and others?
I happen to think that the humor that occurs in Western art, and I mean west of the Mississippi art or scenes of the west of the Mississippi, is relatively unique to the West. It's been my experience that artists east of the Mississippi take themselves far too seriously to be funny, and they somehow think that's not serious enough, and so they're by God not going to be having any humor as part of that. And that's actually something I'm doing in my work now, is to try to find those humorous artists. And it even finds its way into those artists that we probably don't include in the Western genre, like William Wiley. William Wiley was hilarious. He's in San Francisco. He's all part of a whole different thing. But that ability to see humor in Western things, I think, is a critical part of the storytelling. I really do believe that. It's Fred Harmon right here, that pen and ink drawing. That's fantastic. And Fred Harmon, of course, was a cartoonist who drew Red Ryder. And yet he took himself seriously enough to do humorous drawings, and also knew how important it was to be part of the Cowboy Artists of America. So humor has a place in art. You know, sometimes it's okay not to take everything so damn seriously. It's really okay. And I think Western artists are uniquely set up to do that, because there's humor in a cow camp. There's humor in an Indian village. You know, that stoic Native American that we see in certain circles. You know, sometimes they have kids too. They have funny stuff that happens. All peoples do. It's multicultural. Imagine that. But I think that's just, in my own look at art of the American West, it's relatively unique to art of the west of the Mississippi. Stone face over here.
I know. I mean, my favorite Russell paintings are the ones that are the humorous ones. Quiet Day in Utica, or Meat's Not Meat Till Meat's in the Pan, or some of those great ones. We have one on loan from the Buffalo Bill Museum that's way politically incorrect these days. It's the guy shooting at the floor, and it's called Making the Chinaman Dance. And, you know, it's his turn. He's the greenhorn, and he's getting the greenhorn treatment. He just happens to be Chinese. The best part of that painting is there's an Indian in the corner stifling a laugh, because it's not his turn. And to him, that's funny. And it's not that stoic Indian. Now, it's not the image we want of Western art going around the world to represent us necessarily, but it's some humor in there about a non-humorous subject. And it softens it up and lets us talk about it and get it out there and get it out in the open. I wish there were more humor in the contemporary Western art I see, but at the same point, you always say, how much would you pay for a joke? You know, and somehow we've gotten this idea that perhaps if it's got humor in it, it lessens the importance or the greatness of the painting, or it's not as serious as a traditional treatment of the subject. And I think that's just the opposite. If you look at Russell's work, you know, the ones you would most want to own are the ones that have that great humor and that great story in them. And, you know, I'd love to see us come back to that somehow.
We just acquired a sculpture at the National Cowboy Museum by an artist from Santa Fe named Luis Tapia. And it's called La Princesa del Rodeo. And he tells about being a little kid and seeing the rodeo princesses coming in the entry parade in the arena at the Santa Fe Rodeo. Well, his interpretation of that is La Princesa del Rodeo was actually a pull toy. And he saw those women in a certain way, and it's real tongue-in-cheek. And we acquired that because, of course, we're the National Rodeo Hall of Fame. I mean, can we not laugh at ourselves just a little bit? Is something okay with that? Now, I'm sure the Rodeo Historical Society members probably want to shoot me for doing that, but nevertheless, I thought that was a legitimate thing. That humor's really okay, especially in these dire times. You know, it's okay to have a little laugh or two.
Well, and that Hispanic style art has more of that humor in it as well.
Absolutely.
More traditionally.
Mm-hmm.
Contemporary art and artists are more open to broadening the definition of Western American art. It's always tied to region, but not necessarily tied to a specific group or a group of subjects. There have always been traditional subjects, cowboys and Indians. But there have also been great Western landscapists, and you've got they're in the pantheon of Western American art, and a great genre, and they're great artists that have represented that subject matter. But I think that there's been a broadening over time of not only subject matter but technique, and experimentation is not it's not just your yesterday's laundry that they're washing and drying again. It's new, it's experimental in many cases. If you look at the work upstairs of the big red moon and the horses underneath, that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
Your question, Emily, though, went to social commentary, not just humor, and we've just talked about the humor part of it. I don't see it so much in the work of the cowboy artists necessarily, but in some of the more contemporary artists that are doing other things within Western art, like the ones that were in the exhibition that we did here that Michael alluded to 3 or 4 years ago, where you had a painting like one that Ann Coe did, where you have a cowgirl herding some cows, looking for a watering hole, and ending up at a swimming pool in a subdivision with a golf course in the background, and it's called Suburban Ranchette Looking for a New Watering Hole. And if that's not a comment about what's happening in the West in terms of the water supply and overbuilding and resorts taking the place of where there were pastures, then I don't know what is. And so it's a really, on its surface, it's a very fun-looking painting, but it's dealing with a very serious subject. And so I think there's opportunity for there to be some social commentary and still be an interesting painting and a good painting. But I don't see that as often as I might like to. And again, it's all about making a living. Is anybody going to want to buy that painting and live with it? And so we have to cut the artist some slack sometimes on those issues as well, that, you know, we got to put beans on the table.
Well, the other part of that is almost reverse social commentary, like Bruce was talking about this morning. And there are many people who have no clue that they're still Native Americans that live out in the West. I've been actually witnessed that. We had a Native man who worked at Panhandle Plains Museum where I worked for many decades. And he actually said people would say, I didn't think there were any Indians left. The same is true of cowboys. Our friend Red Stegall says you can't see a real cowboy from the blacktop. And so many people might see Bruce's or the other CA painters' work as simply nostalgic, when in fact, you go out in the sixes right now, you go to the JAs right now, you go up on the Haythorns up in Nebraska, or any of those ranches, there's a cowboy doing that right now. So you can have a cheeseburger when you drive through the drive-up at McDonald's in your air-conditioned car. Somebody's doing that. And likewise, the bun that's on your cheeseburger came from wheat that was grown by a farmer in Kansas who's doing that work, not right now because they already cut it and it's already on the way to the milling deal. But that's reverse social commentary. This is real. This is happening now. It's a kind of reportage. It's not dissimilar. These guys and women are historians of the American West right now. Just like Catlin said in 1832, I want to be the historian of the American Aborigine before he disappears. They're doing the same thing. And everybody's been trying to throw that last shovel full of dirt on the last cowboy for 150 years. Well, guess what? They're still out there. But you can't see them from the blacktop. And fortunately, we have seers like Bruce Green and the others who allow us to see them from, and we don't have to get out of the air conditioning to do it. It's so convenient. Thank you. We should just say thank you.
Back to our topic the whole day, which is the continuation of tradition. As you said, the presenting that they are still there doing the same thing they've been doing for 200 years or whatever it is. Maybe the tools are a little different, the techniques are a little different, but they're still doing the same thing. And they're still there. That is social commentary in and of itself, and making sure that we still remember. So relates back to our overarching topic, I think.
Well, and it's not an art of elitism. These guys are workers are on the high end of the scale as far as their own appreciation of their own abilities, but on the low end of the scale in terms of economic getting ahead economically. The pay is still much less than elsewhere, but they do it anyway because they like it like that, and they have their own independence. And I suggested many of the people who are critical of the art of the West, that's one of the things that they don't understand, that it's proletarians, using a term from another era, a proletarian sort of artwork that glorifies in many ways, or certainly places it in the forefront of a noble kind of profession, whether it be cowboy, Indian, or whatever. And then the landscape and the wildlife are just gravy on top of that.
Thank you for stating that they're depicting the West that is contemporary and that is here, that we just don't see living in the cities or not out in that rural West. But I also love to see, in Phil's artwork and others, the city lights, the pair of sunglasses, billboards, trailers, bright red cowboy boots that kind of automatically just zoom us into that this is a depiction of contemporary life. Are artists of the CIA painting enough of these sort of little tidbits that show us that it is immediately the contemporary West? I mean, I'm still looking for ATVs, helicopters herding cattle, drones, and cell phones, because I haven't seen as much of that in the art. And as a curator too, I do want to see some of these things, because I want to also have a record of today's West, that I'm sure the cowboys have cell phones that they're looking at when they're out there. And is there a responsibility for these CA artists to paint this in Western life, to authentically preserve and perpetuate that aspect, or is it not that important? They're doing it in their own way.
Well, I think the photographers have stolen the march in some ways over the artists. And the reason for that, I'm not quite sure, and I haven't talked to enough of either one to understand, but you see a lot of, there are wonderful photographs of, by Skeeter Hagler, who won the Pulitzer Prize for a photograph called Helicopter Cowboy years ago. And many of them have seen the irony and the interesting nature of the contemporaneity of cowboy life today, and have not found it difficult to not only present that work but to sell that work. And so I would leave it to the artist to decide what they paint and why. But I certainly think that if the audience will allow it, it works beautifully in photography. But I think the audience has something to say about that.
Also in film, there are two recent films that have come out. John Langmore just made one, and Byron featured that at OU a couple years ago. But also there's a young man who just came out of the University of Texas, Stoney Davis, who just produced a film recently released called Cowboys Across Borders. And because his family comes from both Mexico and also Central Texas, he visited the family ranch in Central Texas and filmed part of his documentary there. Then he went to Chihuahua and filmed amongst the family vaqueros that are there. Then he went up to Montana and filmed the Montana cowboys herding with ATVs and so on. And they were simply saying, this is the most efficient way we can do what we do here in Montana. And then he went all the way down to South America to film amongst the gauchos. And it's all cowboying. And so that Cowboys Across Borders, that's filmmaker, picking up what Byron said about the photographers. Rob Kendrick has also been involved in some of those things, and John Langmore and so on. But the filmmakers are doing a good bit of work there too. And I would also answer it, I think there's also there's an expectation of authenticity, whatever that really means. And does that mean being able to count the beads on the Cheyenne moccasins? Well, guess what? Sometimes that makes for a really bad painting. I mean, they're just boring. And that's a careful balance that every artist has to remember to make, to be authentic in this context, but also make good art. And sometimes they don't go hand in glove. Sometimes the authenticity makes the art suffer, and vice versa. You know, Grant Wood, to quote him again, he said, we're not making colored photographs. I mean, that's not what y'all are doing. That's not what the CA's doing. And so maybe, and I think there's room at the table for telling that cowboy story as it evolves.
I think Byron is correct, and it's a lot about what would the audience accept and what is the audience willing to buy into. In case in point, I point out two paintings that hang at our museum. One is a Peter Hurd painting of a pasture scene from the 1950s in northern New Mexico, and there's an obvious 1950s pickup truck right in the middle of this painting, where they're feeding the cattle off the pickup truck. And maybe three paintings down, there's a Tim Cox painting from 2015 maybe. And Tim was one of the ones who really did do the contemporary cowboy. And if you know how to read the gear that's on the saddle and what he's wearing, I mean, he's got like a Carhartt jacket on, and he's got a modern cowboy hat. And if you know the saddlery and the tack and things, you know this is stuff from the last 15, 20 years, not a historic cowboy. That doesn't bother anybody because they don't know necessarily how modern that is. And they look at this pickup truck and this other painting and they just don't want to look at it. They don't want to think about that being out there, that's not a reality of life, and that, you know, they wouldn't want that painting necessarily because it's too modern, even though it's now 70 years ago and a historic piece at this point. So I think it's a little of a pushback from the audience, and I agree with you from a curatorial standpoint. It would be nice to have some more modern depictions to mix in with these things and create that dialogue, but I'm not sure the audience is out there for it or ready for it.
Well, the same thing's true. You mentioned native arts. How often have we seen Navajo blankets with pickup trucks woven into them that somehow are not as valuable as a more traditional one? You know, that happens all the time. And also modern beadwork of stiletto heels that are fully beaded. Does that mean that make them less native in some way? I think not. And we actually just acquired at the Cowboy Museum a great fillet painting, which is full of irony because it has this almost all sky, towering clouds, and yet it's a depiction of a reenactment of a Chisholm Trail cattle drive. Not a Chisholm Trail cattle drive, a reenacted one. That's real tongue-in-cheek, in my opinion, and yet it's very nostalgic and therefore authentic. Well, wait a minute. What? These guys are play acting at being on a Chisholm Trail cattle drive, but therefore it's authentic. But it's painted in a neo-regionalist style, so the clouds are right out of a Thomas Hart Benton painting. So what's authentic? What does that really mean?
Back to our humor, social commentary, I think you see a lot more of that in Native artwork, where you see natives riding in pickup trucks. We have a wonderful Chanteau Begay painting that depicts that. And Willie Nelson's on one side, and Waylon Jennings is on the other. You can see him in the rearview mirrors, and they're driving, and the artist is in the middle because he's listening to them out of both sides. And there's lots of symbology and fun things going on with it. There's social commentary in the bumper stickers and so on. And so there's room for all of it out there. I'm not sure that the Cowboy Artist is the place to be looking for it, at least at the current time.
So let's talk about the autobiographical nature of some of their work. Are they distant observers or engaged participants? Whose stories are they telling? Their own, their friends, their patrons, or a combination? I thought it was amusing when one of my board members commented that he knew Tom Lovell and that he would paint himself in as the model on some Native American figures. And of course, you see here Wayne Bays painting his now wife, who is engaged to at the time. And we know that Charlie Russell did this on occasion as well, painting himself as a Native American figure, using himself as a model. So what's the temptation here for artists to insert themselves into their work? And how often do you see this in Western art or just all over?
We had this painting, a mural, 22-foot wide mural at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, hung over the entrance vestibule, called Working Cattle on the Open Range by H.D. Bugbee. And Mr. Bugbee painted himself on 3 different horses as 3 different cowboys in that painting because, you're your most available model. You're always around. And so that's what I used to tell people when I would talk about that painting. It also had J. Evans Haley in the far left in a yellow shirt. But you're your most available model. You're always around. I'm sorry? Yes. You're right. Right, exactly. So, and we talked about this the other day. Virtually every Will James work of art ever made is a self-portrait. He's on every single bucking horse. You can tell by his hooked nose. That's him on every single horse. And yet, he's highly valued. And so it was a firsthand experience, and we heard from Bruce this morning about getting dust in your nose. Some of those boys in Connecticut never saddled a horse, never rode anywhere. But nevertheless, they're still considered authentic.
I can't do any better than that.
As one of the tenets of the CAA has been to have these social gatherings and act as this artist collective together. So in what ways have this part of their mission and objectives been conducive to producing Western art and really maturing artists' careers up through the organization? And are there any ways perhaps in which it hasn't been supportive of artists or not worked well within the Western genre?
Did you say in what way has it not
been?
Yeah,
are there any ways perhaps conversely if it hasn't been supportive of artists' careers?
Well, I think anytime you have a collegial group, it can work both for you or against you. But the opportunity to exchange ideas and to see a lot of, you learn by seeing and see a lot of work and see a lot of technique, and you make a choice. Bruce can tell you better than I, but you make a choice of what works for you and what doesn't, and it's different for each person. And so it seems to me that group of artists that has a lot of advantages, and there are obvious disadvantages if one begins to just mimic whatever the art du jour is, or the subjects du jour. But I haven't seen that to be the case over most of these years. I'd rather Bruce probably could address that subject better than I, but what do you think?
I think that the art business is a relational business. And I think anytime that we can get together and we can meet collectors and hear their thoughts, I think that leads to the production of other artwork that causes us to think out of the box that we've been in. And I think that I'm sure that the collectors that I know enjoy getting to know the artist. And in my case, they want to hear about those experiences firsthand. And I think it makes the whole process more enjoyable.
So, to answer the question, I think that it has been a mutual aid society, which was one of the tenets from the very beginning, was to help each other protect their rights, which was one of the very specific things they talked about, but also business practices, creating these social opportunities at the shows to meet the collectors, and when they go on the trail ride to have their time with themselves and talk about art, and maybe go in small groups to see shows together or travel together and do things. They had opportunities to go overseas, I know, at various times, and take trips, whether it was specifically through the Cowboy Artists or other groups, to get exposed to different art around the country and around the world. Those have all been valuable experiences for the guys. As Byron alluded to, it can go both ways. Sometimes you may have limits or the rules, so to speak, that may limit subject matter or interpretation or whatever, may not work for everybody. And artists, many of them who are free spirits, don't fit into the group model. We had the opportunity to host the 50th anniversary of the group at the Booth Museum in 2015. And I asked several of the artists at that time, how does this group stay together this long? The most maybe telling example to look at in Western art that you're the most familiar with is the Taos Society. You know, it lasted, 15, 17 years as a formal group. And so I asked the guys, how have you stayed together for 15 years? And they said, we liked each other. We were doing well together. We liked each other. We liked being in each other's company. And the people that didn't kind of fit with that, wandered off or whatever. And they've been able to last that long. Fred Fellows said, we like each other. The Taos guys, when they started imploding, didn't like each other by that point, right?
Taos Society was founded in 1915 and it lasted until 1927. It was already fraying by 1922. I always say that you put that many egos together in a box and shake them up, something's not going to go right. But you're creative people and passionate people, and it's amazing that the CAs have stayed together. And of course, there's been fights, I know, and fractioning and fracturing and so on, and people have joined and left. So it needed to be organic. Art's organic. It's always a process. And so my answer to that is this presumption that seems to be common today, is that a group that flocks together, there's an expression about birds of a feather flocking together. I didn't make that up. And somehow being a group that likes to be together and has shared interests is somehow exclusionary. I don't think that's true at all. I think that's a presumption. And I think we need to be real careful about that sort of thing. Everything needs freshening. Everything needs new blood, new insertion, new everything. But sometimes refreshing just for refreshing is sometimes counterproductive. Sometimes it ain't broke. There's a lot of trying to fix stuff that ain't broke. In the CAs, it's had its ups and downs, of course, but in all arts organizations, the TSA, they were fighting from the get-go. From the very first meeting in July of 1915. They couldn't, Blumenschein didn't even show up for the first one. But yet, they get elected president when somebody's out of the room, or refuse to be secretary or treasurer or whatever. Artists, they're a tough group, man.
Cookies.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Isn't that one of them?
Oh, yeah, that is. And one called the other in a bald-headed SOB,
Speaking of wives, I think that's another glue that's helped hold the cowboy artists together over the years is these guys have great wives and supporters of their careers, and many of them are directly involved in their businesses, and they've gotten along as well generally, and that's been an important glue. It's part of the group as well. And I think their support is way underrated.
Thank you for that statement about artists flocking together and liking each other and that cohesion of a group. That's important. Today I think we all hear in academic circles and now greater culture at large, issues surrounding identity, equity, inclusion, sort of buzzword topics. I know the CAA in the past has been criticized for lack of diversity in their members and that they don't have women artists. Has this harmed their success with broader audiences, collectors, museums? Does it, as we mentioned, does it matter whether or not any of this, if they need any of that? They have, of course, a couple of Native American members in their groups in the past and present. Does that type of difference matter in these groups? Or is it great how it functions now, and should that not be a concern, really?
Did they ask the same of a plumber, of the plumbers union, or other occupations? I think that that when it's time, it'll be time. Whether they need to respond to I'm trying to choose my words carefully. They need to respond to the tenets of the times is up for debate. I think many times artists have swum against the tide, and you mentioned that came into being at a time when art was not the realism was not the style, and so a group has the ability to change if and when it chooses, and whether they should or they shouldn't is not up for me to tell them what to do with their artwork. I think the degree to which it's accepted and which it's attracted an audience is going to be will tell the tale.
Emily, I don't think us three white guys are the right guys to ask
Yeah.
this question to. How did you, as a female curating this exhibition, feel about it?
Oh, now you put me on the hot seat. That's true. I often take people with, how they are and what they say they are, and I don't necessarily always need them to be something else. Sure, if they would have some women members, would that change some of the perspectives or angles of what they're producing, the artwork, what they're showing? Yeah, it possibly could. But, I guess we could say the same thing about, male authors, or, who is right to, can you accurately write a female character as a male or a male as a female character? I think these are all discussions that are always going on. But I suppose, for me, what matters is their tenet of, their mission to produce an authentic West as it was and is today. And so I think when I see those paintings, that really show to me the West that I can see. I mean, there's parts of the West that they're painting that I don't even see. I don't go out into those very, very rural places or see all those aspects that are also important to capture. But, no, I mean, because the Western art market is so broad, at least, and it's not so constricted. There are some great women artists that are painting the West that are in our Night of Artists show and a lot of Western art exhibits. So it's not as if there isn't a place and a voice for women artists and they're not accepted into, let's say, the fold in a different way, in the auction circuit, in ways they've moved around. So, and I've just heard this from, sort of academic circles or reading past, with their break with the Phoenix Art Museum, past articles about, the shakeup with that. But I guess if it's not within art circles, within artists, if they don't have or begrudge anything, then, who am I to say that they need to include them? As long as I'm, of course, in my role as a curator, including women artists, and their perspectives and what I'm doing, I think that's fine. That they, as an art collective, don't necessarily need to.
Just add to that, we have a very active oral history program at the museum, and I've interviewed couples of artists, particularly Terry Moyers and John Moyers. John was a longtime CA member, Fred Fellows and his wife Deborah, and asked both of them separately their thoughts about this. And probably the best comment I got was from Deborah, who said, "Well, what did Fred say about it?" And I really didn't answer, and she said, "He didn't give you that old 'they couldn't piss in the woods if there was a woman around' defense, did he?" So that was her thoughts about it.
Yes, Bruce, please.
Okay, just probably this is a great point to say something. There's a lot about this going on in the art world today. The CA has never excluded women. There's nothing gender specific in the bylaws of the Cowboy Arts of America. And back as early as the 70s, there was a woman that the CA's talked to about a membership, and Bettina Steinke, the great artist Bettina Steinke. And Bettina's answer was, "Don't you think that's better left the way it is?" And I have personally had discussions with some of the best contemporary women artists today who gave me exactly the same answer that Bettina did. And Bettina told me this personally. She was a friend of mine years ago. And in reality, what we have today is the only gender-specific art shows really designed that way are the women's Western art shows. Women of the West and the new organization, Cowgirl Artists of America. Okay.
Can I just make a comment?
Sure.
I don't know that it's for me to say either, but I think I think an organization, however the organization is structured, is up to it. But as long as public institutions fairly represent, the available art out there, that's good. That's people want to see, whether that's made by, the elephant stomping on the paper or a woman or a man. That's where it should be seen, and it's not up to me to tell you how to run your organization. So.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments, Bruce, especially letting us know from your perspective of how things have happened and how artists have felt and spoken to you about. So that's good to hear.
Can I jump in here and say something, because this is related to this, and I'm going back to my mentor Byron Price on this. He alluded to something that I think bumped up against something that I would call museum standards or museum quality. That frankly I think some of our people in the museum world have drifted away from, given that it's fashionable to be more inclusive. I've seen some stuff hanging on walls next to great masterpieces that just make me see red. And it was all in an effort to be more embracing. So with the Cowboy Artists of America, I'd be interested to know about self-governance and because I know one of the part of the mission statement is a certain level of connoisseurship. Is there self-policing that goes on, and at what level? And then museums have an obligation to take that even beyond the hands of and the philosophy of the CAs. What's acceptable? And I think sometimes we're blinded by the zeal of sales, and aesthetic quality and museum standards are sacrificed in that respect. And I'd like to, because Byron bumped up against this and talked about it, but he's much nicer than I am about it.
Well, yeah, you've got a very inclusive presentation up right now at the Cowboy Museum that has undergone some great additions since you've been there. That when you gave our group a tour last year when we were there with Red Stegall, to point out examples of where you've added inclusiveness into your presentation, but not at the cost of quality. But in order for that to happen, the material's got to get created. There've got to be people doing black cowboys and Native Americans as more than just a stoic Indian, and women in important roles. You know, every wagon that went west didn't just have a guy with it, right? And the women of the West as subject don't get as much grist for the mill. So you've got to look harder and smarter to find those examples to be able to create that inclusiveness that we want to have on our walls, to have the story be full. Because to tell the story and leave part of it out lessens the whole story.
Just a couple of comments here about the Sons of Charlie Russell exhibit. First, this may not need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that we decided to do this show because we thought this group is really important to the history of Western art. Whether, and as Emily was putting it together and as we had meetings with our staff internally about what the show's about, I was very clear to everyone that this is not a history show, this is an art show, and we're concentrating on the quality of the art and the composition and all the other things that go with that, not the history of the Cowboy Artists of America one way or another. And I'm fine with the conversation going that way. I'm not trying to disrupt that. The other part of that, though, is that not every Cowboy Artists of America member is in this exhibit. Emily curated the show, and we were selective in who we included and who we didn't. So when it goes to that connoisseurship question, Michael, we edited the membership before we mounted the show. And that doesn't mean that there are not good artists that got left out. Space is a concern, of course. It's only 4,000 square feet. But we tried to select what we thought were the best examples of the Cowboy Artists of America throughout the entire 60-year history. So just wanted to make those 2 points in this conversation, because I don't want to, and I haven't heard a lot of it, but there's a little bit like, why are we supporting an artist that doesn't support women artists, but through membership, that type of thing? Why would you even want to do a show like this? Those are people who don't really understand the history of the art, and we've answered those questions as they've come along, but it's probably good for this group to know that those questions do get asked out there among our membership and our community, and the best way to do that is to have a conversation about it and to be able to present it. So we just wanted to add those comments.
Put a very brief comment, souvenir of a good friend of mine. His name was Tex Taylor. I'm 92 years old. Yes. I had a very good friend of mine who was born in Gonzales, Texas. He became one of the top roping artists and good friend of Will Rogers. And he died in 1973. And his name was Tex McLeod, I'm sorry. Tex McLeod. And he told me, I visited with him many times, I even visited with him in England, and he told me that Charlie Russell is the only one who knew to his own appreciation how to dress cowboy, to dress Western. So that's quite a compliment from him, because he knew all the greats. He knew Will Rogers, he knew Tom Mix, he traveled to Africa, he traveled to Australia with rodeos, and so that reminds me. And also, the gentleman mentioned Will James. Will James is quite an enigmatic person, because I found a lot of things about his life. Actually, he wasn't, according to his story, he was born from, what he called, excuse me for looking for my words. He built a story about his own life, but actually his life, he was born in Ontario. He was French, because I read some of his mail to his parents in French. So he was not the person he claimed to be, but his drawings, his bucking horses, and also the movies that were made after his fiction. I'm thinking about the story of the horse, Smokey, and all. The West was born sometimes with people claiming to be who they were not. You know. And one of you also mentioned the Chisholm Trail. Well, the one who wrote the best about the Chisholm Trail was Monty Blue, and he was from England. I think I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
Through a number of years, the CA artists have either worked on family farms growing up and ranches, or have themselves purchased land and small ranches to run. Today, I think of, Chad Poppleton comes to the forefront. He's always talking about his ranch that he's working. Do you think this connection to the land and adopting a rural lifestyle to live alongside their work as artists is an important thread that runs through the CAA?
Say it one more time.
Do you think that this connection to the land, their connection to the land and making, an effort to live in the rural West and having also an aspect of working on ranches and maybe working a little cow herd alongside their role as living and working artists is important to, being a part of a CAA membership or having that identity?
Can't hurt.
I think it certainly can be, and we certainly heard from Bruce this morning how his experiences inform his work. You mentioned Chad. I would think even more so of Grant Redden, growing up on a ranch in in Wyoming, and still living in ranch country and being involved with those people in the rural areas certainly informs his work. We have a wonderful exhibition up right now of his work paired with Arturo Chavez landscapes. That's an incredible tour de force of painting, and really shows ranch life and family life on the ranch. But I don't think it's necessary. Certainly, as we heard earlier, Bruce said, Ken Riley and Howard Turpning, weren't the best guys sitting the horse, but they might have been some of the best artists who could come down the pipe. So I think it, as Byron said, it can't hurt, certainly can help, but it's not necessary. That's what I would say.
In your all's estimation, which CA artists stand out for you as some of the ones that have pushed the genre of traditional Western art forward? I know for me, when I think about sculpture, Fritz White comes to mind, and I know Gordon Snidow painting the contemporary scenes of cowboys as well. Your thoughts on that, or who?
Me, Tom Ryan would be my choice of poster child for the cowboy artists because of he sort of fits the mold of being an early illustrator and trained as an illustrator and then becoming a very fine easel painter. I've said that he was, because he concentrated so much of his work on the 4/6 ranch, and it's so evident that these paintings were done there, and he became so close to the individual cowboys and the people who were involved with the ranch and the landscape and the activities, that he really was a court painter to, if you will, to a ranch that in some cases been called an empire of grass, and his work is, really epitomized the traditions and the personnel and the activities of a single ranch that came to stand for a lot of other ranches and cowboys. But I think that intimate relationship with the individuals who were involved in the various cowboys and their activities and so forth really has made his work really strong and has given it a certain identity that you just know it when you see his work, if you know anything about how it came about. And I think there's probably others that you could allude to, but Tom Ryan to me is one of the great painters, and has really given us a portrait of the 4/6 ranch in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, and at least until his untimely passing. That is as good as it gets, in my opinion.
Having worked on that 50-year retrospective of the CA that we did in '95, I alluded to earlier, I was amazed at some of the people who helped push things forward in different mediums. And I think you're exactly right. Fritz White in sculpture is the one, for me, that continually was coming up with innovative compositions and ideas, like the one that's on the screen, In Search of the Snow Goose, which we have at a monument size at the booth. But a piece that he did called From the Ashes of Many Fires, which is an Indian torso mounted on a stream of smoke lifting up. That's a very precarious looking sculpture, is another example that jumps out at to me. The people who've kept watercolor alive in the CA over the years, David Halbach and a couple others that come to mind, keeping that as an important medium when sometimes they're swimming upstream against the oil painters. I look at the work that Ken Riley did in his best years that's very ethereal and spiritual, a tremendous draftsman, tremendous compositions. The weight of the figures in those paintings is amazing. The work that John Moyers did in the years he was in, you go back and look at the works that he won Best of Show for, like 6 or 7 times out of a 15-year period. When every year there was a different set of judges. I mean, some of these shows, they have the same group every year that judges. Every year they'd have 3 different judges, usually a couple of artists and a museum person or vice versa, or a collector. And so for the same person to be doing innovative work and winning that every year impressed me in those years that he was involved. And then I think Phil Epp being inserted into the membership just recently has brought some new and exciting things. So in terms of pushing the envelope and nudging the borders a little bit, I think those are the folks that come to my mind.
Well, in terms of full disclosure, most of my work is with artists who are deceased. They're a lot easier to deal with. They don't procrastinate, and they're never late, and they don't complain. So my experience with the CAs is relatively limited, and my area of interest is pretty finite with those who work in that areas. So I would echo what Byron said about Tom Ryan. I mean, he's we're just real blessed to have some amazing Tom Ryan works at the National Cowboy Museum. And Philip's been a friend for many, many years. So I've always admired his work because he has a unique vision. Paul Moore, a sculptor, speaking of those who push the envelope, Paul creates 2.5 dimension works of art that are just mind-blowing, frankly. largely from Native American traditions. So Paul Moore's one I think worth looking at for sure. T.D. Kelsey, you have this great sculpture right down here on the river. That's about as powerful as a cow moving picture or moving sculpture as you'll ever see. And he gets some of that snarling that goes on when they're all milling around and doing that kind of stuff. And this isn't to suck up to Bruce, but I've known Bruce Green's work for about 25 years when I started doing, believe it or not, because remember, I'm not a salesman, I'm a historian. And I did an exhibition at sale at Panhandle Plains called the Panhandle Plains Invitational Western Art Show and Sale, beginning in the year 2000, and it ran for 17 years. And Bruce was kind enough to send some pictures from the JAs to that show in the early part of the go, and then he got famous and he stopped coming. But in any case, the freshness of his paintings, and I'm so glad he talked about plein air sketches this morning, and the snapshot effect of being in that country, which I'm intimately familiar with because I lived out there for 3 decades. And so Bruce's work has great appeal to me. And I was going to ask him, I'm going to conclude with a question for him, if that's okay. And I meant to ask you this morning, Bruce. Mr. Remington's said something along the lines is, my paintings will fade, but I will endure in bronze. So how would you answer that in terms of your own work? Do you see yourself as a sculptor or a painter, or which is how you want your legacy to read?
Do I see myself as a sculptor or a painter? On any given morning, it's a new world. I wake up and today I'm a sculptor, or today I'm a painter. And as to how, I made the statement this morning. Really, Michael, I don't know how, and when you get to this point in your life that I'm at, and you start to say, well, is anybody going to remember or care, later on about what I did, and then to try to figure out whether they care more about the sculpture or whether they care more about the paintings. That's just over my pay grade. I'm just going to keep going back in that studio, and I'm still studying every day and still trying to get, do better work that I'm more satisfied with. So, and if they remember me fondly, I don't mind either way. So.
Thank you.
Y'all heard that I have my first degrees in painting. And I realized when I was in art school, I was never going to be an artist, because unlike Bruce Green and the other artists who are in the CAs, I don't have that burning thing inside me that means I better create something today or I'm going to die. They have that. The real artists have that. And that's what comes through with the CA artists that I follow or care to look at. That's what I see. I want to see their work. And even if you don't see their work, you feel the work. And you feel the experience. Those are the ones that appeal to me.
Bruce said at some point this morning that he doesn't draw or paint every 3 days. He gets a little antsy, and I've seen artists like that 24, 48 hours, if they haven't made a mark on something, they really are getting juju going on.
It reminds me of that anecdote about Russell, how he always had to have beeswax in his pocket, just molding it in and out, just something for his hands to do. So I thought...
Both leaned over to each other when you showed that picture of you playing plein air with that 5-foot canvas in the middle of those flowers. That's a great picture, and I think that says it all.
My final question. Can the CAA last another 50 years with the quality of the new artists coming in relation to those going emeritus? The artwork's going to be still relevant to audiences today, do you all think?
Well, I certainly think that they can. The subject matter has always been there, and I think the values that are embedded in the work of the CAs and are that we've assigned, if you will, to to Western culture in our own society, as long as it's perceived as vibrant and enduring, then I think the art will, and the artist group has a good chance of continuing on, provided there were individuals to nurture it into being in the first place, and then groups of individuals who have carried on the tradition, and that's how traditions work. And as long as there is a tradition, and those cowboys on the JA Ranch or the 4-6s or any of those are continuing to be in the field, doing their job, and the artists are there to record and interpret and value it, then I think it has a good chance of continuing. As we as a society don't place any value in that lifestyle or that environment, then perhaps it might pass on. But we've been declaring the end of the frontier and the end of the cowboy for all this time, and you can't see them from the road, but as Michael has said, but they're still there, and I think they'll always be there in one form or another. And so I'm not just completely sanguine about it, but I believe that it has a good chance of continuing.
Go ahead.
Well, I always wind up being the contrarian sometimes at these deals, and I'm a realist, so I have that journalism hats on some of the time. I can tell you 4 or 5 years ago, I was pretty darn negative about the future of the group. As the sales were sliding there at the Cowboy Museum, and they were having to share their show with another group, and it didn't have the feel and the camaraderie necessarily that it had previously. I was a little worried about the future of the group, and they've had a renaissance now, moving to Fort Worth and having some support. Because to me it takes 3 things. You got to have the collectors, you got to have the art from the artists, and you got to have some support and logistics to put on the exhibition. I mean, that's really where the rubber meets the road. Are the artists bringing good art, finding collectors to buy it, and is everybody involved at least covering expenses and putting beans on the table? So I think the collectors are back in droves. Even more so, we were talking last night about that the sales are good for tickets for this year. The Fort Worth Stock Show has taken on the administrative part of running the show. I think that takes that out of the hands of the artists, which is a good thing. And now I worry about the artist side. Where are we going to find the next generation of cowboy artists? And if you look at the contemporary art world, I don't know that there are that many artists that are in line with the cowboy artists in terms of their subjects, their styles generally, and so on. Is the group going to get more accepting of bringing in folks like a Phil Epp that have some fresh ideas and bring a little freshness to the art? And if I was a young, really good Western artist today, would I want to be in the group? I mean, that's a real question. You know, do I line up with the way they think about the world, the way I see the world? Do I want to be involved in an organization that does have some responsibility that comes with it? Coming to the trail ride, coming to the meetings, following the dictates of the group in terms of what's acceptable and what's expected. And do I need the group as much as the group needs me? And that's going to be the question going forward. And so my hope is that, yeah, we're going to have another crop of young Bruce Greens and Martin Greeley's and Howard Turpnings and Ken Riley's that are going to come along and embrace the group and want to continue the tradition. But I think that's the real question going forward.
So I was asked by a museum in Hungary about 2 years ago to guest curate an exhibit on cowboys. And I put together a checklist of artifacts, and we packed them up and sent them to Hungary, and that exhibition opened in Hungary in June. They had Night at the Museum in all the major museums in the country of Hungary, called Night at the Museums on the opening night. The Mora Ferenc Museum in Szeged, Hungary, had 7,000 people attend their exhibit on cowboys and Indians that night. It had more people attend that exhibit, more than even at the State Museum in Budapest. So, my way to answer that is there is a great need to see these tales being told through material culture artifacts as well as the paintings and sculpture of the cowboy artists of America. There's a great need worldwide that is not being met except in the paintings and sculpture of outfits like the Cowboy Artists of America. I believe there's a great hunger in our time of superficiality that we're in right now. People are sick of learning about things on their damn square box they carry in their pocket. They want to see something real, and see something real in the transportation devices, the time capsules that are provided by artists like Bruce Green and Paul Moore and others in the CAs and other artists. Donna Howell Sickles, for example, and other artists in the West, Noe Perez, and et cetera. Those are ways to be transported to another place in time, or a place where you are not right then. And we need that. We need that as a people. And especially in this country, where I think we've become a little unmoored. Same thing happened in the 30s. And a man named Henry Nash Smith, who was a regionalist writer at that time, talked about being true to your country, being true to your place. And he especially talked about being true in the American West. In an article he wrote for the Southwest Review in 1929. It's about respect and honor, about what these men and women depict, regardless of that culture. But it's about an embrace of where they live and where they work, or what they honor and celebrate in their work. And that's the American West, because there's a great hunger and a need for that. And I say this a lot, but I'm going to say it again. This country was built on beef and bread, and not on broccoli. Cha-ching. Because there are men and women who did that work and are doing that work right now. And we need something authentic. The world needs authenticity. And whether that authenticity comes through the communication device that's a painting or a sculpture, it's absolutely required for us as human beings. That's a tale of the tongue that needs to be told again and again. And it's up to them to tell it. And people like them to tell it. It's absolutely necessary. It's vital. That's what I'll say.
Thank you all. And I think we have some time for question and answer. I'll probably repeat the question just for the quality of our recording. Oh, no, never mind. I don't have to. So if anyone has any questions, Melanie will hand you a microphone.
I have a kind of a strange question. How did the eastern tribes, the Shawnee, the Miami, the Iroquois, get lost in the American art scene? Because the Western art geographically limits itself, and I think that's unfortunate that it's so limited. And the history of the Eastern Indians was a century before the Western, but the parallels are uncanny, what happened to them and what happened to all the other Native Americans. But is any artistic school or group of artists devoting themselves to the pioneer days of the East?
If you look out for, I think Western Art Collector magazine next month is going to have an article. Is it this month? It just came out. With John Buxton and Robert Griffin and David Wright, who are three top artists from the eastern part of the country who have been doing that work for the last 20 or 25 years. Robert Griffin's gotten his due just in the last maybe 10 years. The other two are still pounding away trying to get there as well. But they've done a tremendous body of work on that, and they're the East Coast equivalent of the artists of the West we've been talking about today. There's also, what's that? There's There's also a sculptor named Judd Hartman who is, I call him the Eastern John Coleman, but he does Native American busts primarily of famous Iroquois era Native Americans, and so that work's out there. It's just you don't see it reported or listed or advertised quite as much, and it's not welcome in all the shows. As Bruce is saying, it would be welcome subject matter in the CA among their guidelines. The Otto Museum at their show normally has a fair amount of that work in it because of their location being more easternly located.
And the Rockwell as well.
At the Rockwell Museum. Now, they don't have a show sale, do they? But it's well represented in their collection.
Yeah, I've seen it in their collection.
Yeah, in their collection. And certainly we have some at the Booth Museum as well. But it's out there. You just have to look a little harder to find it.
I've got two questions. I'll limit it to two. One, is the Cowboy Artists of America still a counterculture group today? It's the first question. And second is, what about pop culture? Because a couple of things, there used to be a lot of paintings of mountain men, for example, and that subject matter has kind of disappeared. And then the kind of parallel to that is the emergence of Native American subject matter. When you go through the exhibit, there's a lot of cowboys in the beginning of it, and as you get toward the end, the bigger and more masterwork paintings are really dominated by Native American themes. So in my thinking about it, I've always kind of pegged that to Dances with Wolves in 1992 as kind of a turning point. But there were earlier turning points in the 1960s and, the Crying Indian and some of those other images in popular culture. But would we still call the CAs a counterculture group today? And what is that influence of pop culture, and was Dances with Wolves as influential as it seems like it might have been?
I would say they are, and especially today, because what is often depicted, non-Native American subjects, I think is seen in some circles as threatening because of what the cowboy represents. I truly believe that, and so therefore the way that certain circles respond to what the CAs represent, or artists like the CAs represent, is to marginalize them and accuse them of being anachronistic. Therefore, everything they're doing is unrelevant or irrelevant to today, when in fact it's never been more relevant because exactly of what they represent. Likewise, Native American subjects, what they represent as well. And they tend to be almost exclusively nostalgic, Native American depictions, almost exclusively. So that segues into your other question. Obviously, Dances with Wolves, Lonesome Dove, obviously, huge movie, and also Open Range. And of course, Yellowstone. You can't escape Yellowstone. And 1883. I personally haven't seen it. I'm probably not be better not say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. If they want to go to Oregon, they should have just gotten on a train, set up, and all the Native American attacks and all that I hear about, that was already over with. So go Hollywood doing what they always do. But as far as counterculture, absolutely, it's a resistance movement. Keep it up, Bruce.
1883 was filmed in New Mexico, not in Hollywood.
Well, Hollywood driven is what I mean. Yeah.
I would echo those comments in that they're counterculture, and that culture is disintegrating, crumbling, being canceled, whatever it is that's going on any given day. So any organization that sticks to its traditions, which again is back to our title for today, the continuing tradition, that can remain as rock solid as they have in their commitment to what they're doing for 60 years, is actually counterculture, in much the same way it was at the beginning, swimming upstream against the art world. As far as the second half was, remind me again?
Just the influence
Pop culture.
and specifically Dances with Wolves.
Well, you mentioned the Mountain Man influence, which came about with Gentle Ben and Jeremiah Johnson and all those Mountain Man things that were in the 70s, Grizzly Adams. I look back at the CA catalogs from the 70s and look at some of the works we acquired in the collection in those years, and there's a lot of Mountain Man material. And then when there wasn't any movies, TV shows, that kind of dried up and blew away. I think the perception is that Indian subject matter dominates our field because some of the top money grossing pieces are Native American, but I was asked to produce 2 books about 5 years ago, which was 40 leading living artists doing cowboy material and 40 leading artists doing Native American material. You would have thought it'd been much easier to fill the Indian book, and it wasn't. We only came up with 35 artists to put in that book, and there's 40 in the cowboy book. And there just weren't as many, it wasn't as deep as I thought it was. The quality's pretty good on the high end, but it peters out pretty quickly. So I think that's a bit of a false perspective because the money, the awards, and some of the top artists, I think, skew that the depth in the cowboy material is much better and deeper than it is on the Native American side of the subject matter divide, so to speak. And my peers in the Western Art group, the Museums West that we talked about earlier, one of the things we do is sit around in the bar at night after our meetings and say, what's going to happen to Western art, what's going to happen to Western museums? And they've been doing it since Byron's days, I'm sure, as well, that, you know, we do worry about the graying of our audience and the people who grew up on Western movies moving on, and where the new patrons and the new collectors going to come from. And sometimes we would say, it's nothing a great Western movie wouldn't fix. Well, is Yellowstone going to be that next thing that gets a new generation interested in the West? As gritty and unrealistic as that is, and as 1883 is, you know, is it going to enamor people to the West, and is that going to get them interested in Western art? I'll take them wherever I can get them.
Okay. Okay, well, let's give Emily, Michael, Byron, and Seth a big round of applause. Thank you all for your openness and your discussion and your sharing. Thank you all for attending. It was wonderful to have you all here. I saw some of you this morning into the afternoon, so I appreciate you all coming for the whole day with us and spending it with us. I know you all have had a chance to go through the exhibit, but go through one more time while it's still here because it's just amazing. And I hope to see you next Saturday. We have an artist workshop, watercolor workshop with cowboy artist Teal Blake. So he's going to be coming and leading a workshop. If you all are interested, come and join us for that. But thank you all again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. And thank you all so much for sharing. It's been an honor. Thank you.